Welcome to Sleepy Crime. Before we start tonight's case, I'd love to hear from you. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from right now. I'm always amazed to see these stories reach people from all over the world. And if you enjoy these quiet late-night dives into true crime, please like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Now, make yourself comfortable. Whether you're lying in bed, wrapped in a blanket, or just sitting in a quiet room with your headphones on, let your shoulders relax, let your breathing slow, and let the noise of the day fade away. Tonight's story isn't loud. It isn't chaotic. It's the kind of darkness that hides in plain sight. A man with a smile, a camera, and an eye for beauty, but also a secret he never intended the world to see. To most people, Rodney Alcala seemed like a talented photographer. A little intense, maybe, but harmless. He carried his camera like an extension of himself, always framing, always watching, always looking for the perfect shot. In the 1970s, he even managed to charm his way onto a televised dating show. He laughed. He flirted. He won. But what no one saw, not the audience, not the judges, not even the woman he won, was what he kept hidden. Not just in his thoughts, but in his home. In a storage box, deep inside a closet, he kept hundreds of photographs. Women. Girls. Some smiling. Some nervous. Some afraid. Many of them still remain unidentified to this day. And those are just the ones we found. Let's begin. Rodney Alcala's story doesn't begin in front of a camera, but in far less glamorous surroundings. Born Rodrigo Jacques Alcala Buquer in San Antonio, Texas, in 1943, he was the son of a Mexican-American family. His father, an ambitious man, moved the family to Mexico when Rodney was still a child, hoping for better prospects. But life there was unstable, and when Rodney was around 11, his father abruptly abandoned the family. It was a moment that left deep marks, not necessarily visible to those around him, but ones that would fester quietly in the years to come. His mother, left to care for the children alone, eventually relocated them to Los Angeles, hoping to give her children a shot at something better. By all outward appearances, Rodney grew into a fairly normal teenager in California. He was intelligent, charismatic when he wanted to be, and, most importantly, able to adapt his personality to suit whoever he was talking to. Teachers saw a bright student. Classmates saw a charming, if slightly aloof peer. And yet, behind that adaptability was an unnerving ability to conceal his true intentions. It was a skill that would serve him in the most chilling ways later in life. After high school, Rodney joined the U.S. Army in 1960, enlisting at just 17. Military life didn't last long. Within a few years, he suffered what the Army would call a nervous breakdown. He went AWOL, absent without leave, and was eventually diagnosed with antisocial personality traits by a military psychiatrist. He was discharged on medical grounds in 1964. Those early evaluations hinted at the cold detachment and lack of empathy that would later define him. But back then, no one was looking too closely. A discharged soldier simply disappeared back into civilian life, and Rodney did just that. The next chapter took him to the East Coast. He enrolled at the UCLA School of Fine Arts, where his natural charm and apparent creativity drew people to him. It was during this time that his obsession with photography began to take root. The camera wasn't just a tool for art. It was a way to control how people were seen, to frame reality on his terms. Friends and acquaintances would later recall how he would approach women, sometimes complete strangers, offering to take their portraits. He had an easy smile, a persuasive tone, and, in an era when aspiring photographers seemed romantic rather than suspicious, few people thought twice about accepting. But underneath that artist's persona, there was a restlessness, a darkness that kept pushing him toward something more dangerous. In 1968, that darkness broke through the surface for the first time in a way that couldn't be ignored. Rodney was seen luring an 8-year-old girl into his Hollywood apartment. A concerned witness, suspicious of the encounter, alerted police. When officers arrived, they found the child alive, but she had been assaulted. Rodney, sensing the walls closing in, fled the state before authorities could bring him to trial. This would become a recurring pattern: opportunity, harm, escape. He resurfaced thousands of miles away, enrolling under a false name at New York University's film school. His professor, none other than Roman Polanski, a strange and unsettling connection in hindsight. Here, Rodney honed not just his technical skills with a camera, but his ability to weave himself into environments without raising alarm. To classmates, he was the charismatic, slightly eccentric film student. To himself, he was simply refining the mask. The foray didn't last. In 1971, FBI agents tracked him down in New York after he appeared on their 10 most wanted list, a face and a name finally connected to the crime in California. He was extradited, tried, and convicted, but not of the most serious charges. The young girl was too traumatized to testify, and prosecutors accepted a plea deal. Rodney was sentenced to just a few years in prison for child molestation. He served less than 3. When he was released, parole boards noted his good behavior and apparent rehabilitation. It was a mistake. Freedom didn't bring reform, it brought escalation. Now in his early 30s, Rodney Alcala began to drift between Los Angeles and other parts of California, working odd jobs, building his photography portfolio, and continuing to lure women into private photo sessions. The images often seemed harmless at first glance: smiling faces, casual poses, but others carried an unsettling energy. Some women he photographed would later recall feeling uneasy, even frightened, as if he was studying them for something beyond the frame. And yet, he kept slipping through the cracks. This was the 1970s, an era without centralized criminal databases, when communication between police departments was slow and incomplete. A man could commit a crime in one county and be a complete unknown just an hour away. Rodney knew this, and he used it. In 1978, his mask of charm and harmless eccentricity reached its most public stage yet. He appeared on the popular television program The Dating Game. Millions watched as he joked with the host, flirted with the bachelorette, and smiled for the cameras. The audience laughed. The judges liked him. He was chosen as the winner. But the woman who won the date later declined to go out with him. She said he gave her a creaky vibe she couldn't ignore. It was a fleeting moment of intuition that likely saved her life. What the public didn't know was that by the time Rodney stepped onto that TV set, he had already killed. And he would kill again. The photographs would keep coming. The charm would keep working. And the darkness, still mostly hidden, would only grow bolder. By the time Rodney Alcala stepped off the Dating Game stage in 1978, he had perfected the art of being seen without truly being known. He could glide into a room and instantly become the most interesting person there. An air of mystery wrapped in the harmless packaging of an artist. But beneath that charisma was an escalating compulsion. He no longer wanted just to photograph beauty. He wanted to possess it, and to control its fate entirely. In the months and years around his television appearance, Alcala's movements became harder to track. He traveled up and down California's coast, sometimes drifting into other states, always with his camera slung over his shoulder. His habit of approaching women in public parks, on beaches, or in coffee shops became almost daily. He would introduce himself as a fashion photographer or a freelance artist, offering free professional portraits. The offer often worked. In the 1970s, a professional photo shoot wasn't something the average person could easily afford, and Alcala's warm smile and apparent confidence made him seem trustworthy enough. But what started as an invitation to a photo shoot often ended in violence. His victims came from different walks of life, teenagers, young women, even children, but all were caught in the same web. Alcala's method was deceptively simple: isolate the subject, gain their trust, and then strike when they were most vulnerable. Sometimes it was sudden, a blitz of overwhelming force. Other times, he let the encounter linger, stretching out the moment between fear and inevitability, as if savoring the control it gave him. Police would later discover that many of these encounters were carefully documented, not with a journal or written notes, but with the photographs themselves. Dozens, perhaps hundreds, of images showed women in various stages of dress, some smiling naturally, others with tight, uncertain expressions. In some shots, the fear was almost invisible, a subtle tension in the shoulders, a shift of the eyes away from the lens, but it was there. A silent record of the moment before the mask of the photographer slipped away and the predator emerged. One of the most haunting elements of Alcala's crimes was his ability to kill without immediately drawing suspicion. Bodies were found, but there was rarely an obvious link between them. Without DNA databases or advanced forensic technology, investigators were left with fragmented evidence. A strangulation here, a battered body there, sometimes sexual assault, sometimes not. The victims didn't fit a single profile, which made the killings harder to connect. Even the method, often strangulation, but sometimes blunt force trauma, seemed to vary just enough to keep police from forming a clear pattern. In 1979, Alcala's double life began to unravel, though not in the way anyone could have predicted. A 12-year-old girl named Robin Samso vanished while riding her bicycle to a ballet lesson in Huntington Beach, California. She was last seen talking to a man who had approached her and a friend on the beach, asking if he could take their pictures. The friend later recalled feeling uneasy about him. When Robin's body was found in the foothills of the Sierra Madre 10 days later, the case became a priority for local law enforcement. Detectives began canvassing the area, showing a composite sketch of the man last seen with Robin. Several people recognized him as Rodney Alcala, including the parole officer who knew him from his earlier conviction. It was the first time his two identities, the convicted offender and the charming photographer, were about to collide in full view of the public. When police searched Alcala's home, what they found was far worse than they expected. Hidden among his belongings was a cache of photographs, hundreds of them depicting women and girls. Some were clearly modeling willingly, others looked confused or frightened. Many were completely unidentified, their fates unknown. Detectives quickly realized they might be looking at evidence of crimes far beyond Robin Samso's murder. The photos were turned over to the FBI, but without names. Most of these women would remain ghosts in an expanding investigation. Still, even with this disturbing discovery, building a case against Alcala wasn't straightforward. His defense attorneys argued that the photos were merely the work of an eccentric artist, that his criminal past was being unfairly used against him, and that there was no direct proof connecting him to Robin's death. The trial became a clash between the image Alcala wanted the world to see and the reality investigators believed they had uncovered. And while that legal battle played out, one chilling fact remained: many of the women in those photographs had never been located. No missing persons report matched their faces. No one came forward to say they had posed for Alcala. It was as if they had simply vanished, erased from the world, but preserved in a frame. The more investigators studied the photographs, the more they began to suspect they weren't just keepsakes. They were trophies. Each image represented a moment Alcala could revisit at will, a frozen record of control and dominance. And if the number of photos was any indication, the scope of his crimes was far greater than anyone had imagined. The trial over Robin Samso's murder was just the beginning. Outside the courtroom, in police evidence rooms across California, those photographs sat in sealed envelopes, each one a potential lead, each one a question mark. And as detectives began to piece together the timeline of Alcala's movements, it became clear that these images were more than art. They were a map, one that could lead to bodies still waiting to be found. As the investigation deepened, detectives began combing through the vast archive of Rodney Alcala's photographs, hoping each image might offer a breadcrumb, a recognizable landmark. A piece of clothing, a necklace, anything that could connect the unidentified faces to real, living people or to unsolved cases. But what they encountered was a wall of silence. The majority of the photographs appeared to have been taken in nondescript locations, flight apartments, blank studio backdrops, stretches of beach that could have been anywhere along California's endless coastline. In some, the women's expressions seemed warm and trusting. In others, there was the faintest trace of apprehension, as if they sensed something was wrong but couldn't quite define it. For investigators, the sheer volume of images was both a gift and a curse. Each photo had the potential to crack open another case, but without identifying information. They were looking at a mosaic of possible victims spread across years, maybe decades. Some images appeared to be from the late 1960s, others from the mid to late 70s. There were also photographs of children, boys, and girls, no older than 10, posed in ways that suggested these were not innocent family snapshots. Detectives understood they weren't just dealing with a murder, they were dealing with a predator who had built an entire double life around exploiting and documenting the vulnerable. As they traced Alcala's movements, a troubling pattern emerged. His jobs and living arrangements were transient, giving him the ability to disappear from one area just as suspicions began to form. He had lived in New York for a time, studying film under Roman Polanski at NYU in the early 70s, and records suggested that some of his photographs might have been taken there. That meant the scope of the case wasn't just California, it could stretch across multiple states, possibly even across borders. This mobility complicated everything. Jurisdictions in that era didn't communicate seamlessly. A missing person in New York might never be linked to a murder in Los Angeles, and Alcala knew it. Witnesses from different parts of the country came forward with eerily similar stories. They met a charming photographer, sometimes in a park, sometimes at a mall, who promised professional portraits. In some cases, they had gone through with the session and walked away unharmed, lucky escapes, they would later realize. Others had uneasy encounters and backed out at the last moment. A few said they had never seen the man again, only to recognize his face years later on the news. While the Robin Samso trial remained the central focus of law enforcement, veteran detectives began to suspect they were standing on the edge of something far bigger, an iceberg with most of its mass hidden beneath the surface. There were cold cases from Los Angeles, San Francisco, Seattle, and New York that seemed to echo Alcala's known methods. Victims found strangled, sometimes posed post-mortem, sometimes left in remote locations. In certain cases, jewelry or small personal items were missing from the bodies, items that, perhaps, Alcala had kept. One particular lead came from the East Coast. In 1971, Alcala had been arrested in New York for the rape of a young girl but had managed to plead to a lesser charge, serving minimal time. That case alone should have placed him permanently on law enforcement's radar. But due to bureaucratic gaps and the lack of centralized offender databases, he slipped through the cracks. It was only after the photographs were made public decades later that New York investigators began to connect some of their unsolved murders to Alcala's time in the city. The psychological profile forming around Alcala was chilling. Unlike impulsive killers who struck in fits of rage, Alcala seemed methodical. He prepared for his encounters, carried tools of control, and often prolonged his attacks. Survivors described a man who would strangle them until they lost consciousness, then wait for them to revive, only to begin the process again. It wasn't just about killing, it was about mastery over life and death, about watching his victims' fear intensify as they realized they couldn't escape. And then there was the trophy-taking. Some killers keep items to relive the act. Alcala's trophies were frozen moments in time. The photographs were his way of keeping his victims forever within reach. Some experts believe he may have revisited those images during periods of inactivity, using them to relive the control he had exerted. This would explain the meticulous organization of his collection, envelopes labeled with dates, boxes arranged in a way only he understood. It was less like an artist's portfolio and more like a personal museum of conquest. But while the photographs whispered of horrors, the evidence that could directly link them to specific murders was scarce. Many of the women in the images had never been reported missing. Others were runaways, drifting through California's counterculture scene, their disappearances unnoticed by families or law enforcement. Alcala thrived in this environment. In a decade when thousands of young people flocked to the West Coast in search of freedom and adventure, he became the perfect predator, invisible in the crowd, camera in hand, smile at the ready. As the Robin Samso case inched toward its verdict, detectives quietly began re-interviewing witnesses from older cases, showing them Alcala's photograph. One by one, connections started to form. Some remembered him exactly. Others hesitated, uncertain after so many years. But the seed was planted. Rodney Alcala wasn't just a murderer on trial for one crime. He might be one of the most prolific serial killers in American history, hiding in plain sight for over a decade. And if the photographs were any indication, the number of victims might never be fully known. By the late 1970s, Rodney Alcala's charm was not only disarming his victims, it was propelling him into places few suspected predators could ever reach. One of the strangest and most telling moments in his story came in 1978, when he appeared on national television as a contestant on the dating game. The setup was classic, a single woman asking a panel of 3 bachelors flirty questions. Their answers meant to be playful, witty, maybe a little suggestive. Alcala sat on stage in front of millions, wearing a broad smile and a confident posture, delivering rehearsed lines with perfect comedic timing. The host and audience laughed along. He seemed relaxed, even charismatic, the kind of man who could put people at ease. The Bachelorette, Cheryl Bradshaw, would later recall her first impressions. Alcala seemed appealing, clever, and engaged during the taping. In the competitive, game show atmosphere, he stood out among the other contestants. When the time came for her to choose, she picked him without hesitation. He stepped forward, beaming, as the applause filled the studio. On camera, it looked like the start of a light-hearted television romance. But off camera, things were very different. Shortly after the taping ended, Cheryl met Alcala in person, and something about him triggered an immediate, deep unease. She couldn't explain it fully, but there was a darkness in his eyes, a coldness beneath the charm. She told the show's producers she didn't want to go on the date. It may have been the decision that saved her life. What makes this moment so haunting in retrospect is how perfectly it illustrates Alcala's dual nature. On stage, he was the ideal bachelor, funny, handsome, approachable. But beneath that veneer, He was a predator who had already claimed multiple lives and was actively looking for his next victim. For detectives piecing together his crimes years later, the footage of him on the dating game would become an almost surreal artifact. Here was a man who, in between rapes and murders, was casually appearing on national television, smiling for the cameras, basking in applause. At the time of his television appearance, Alcala was already on law enforcement's radar in a limited way, though not nearly to the extent he should have been. His criminal record included the 1972 assault on an 8-year-old girl in California, for which he served a short sentence before being released. In a system plagued by leniency and poor coordination, he was free to move, to reinvent himself, to shift from city to city. The dating game appearance occurred during a period when he was actively photographing women under the pretense of building his professional portfolio. Many of those women, seen in the cache of images later found in his storage, may have met him during these years. Witnesses would later tell police that Alcala had an almost hypnotic way of making people feel both seen and flattered. He used his camera as a social tool, a prop that justified approaching strangers in public. Beaches, parks, and shopping centers became his hunting grounds. He would offer free portraits, sometimes showing samples of his work, images that, to the untrained eye, seemed professional and artistic. For young women trying to break into modeling, or for those simply caught up in the free-spirited openness of the era, it must have seemed harmless. And for many, it was. Alcala didn't attack every person he photographed. But for others, agreeing to that offer marked the beginning of a nightmare. Detectives now believe that during the years surrounding his dating game appearance, Alcala's killing methods became more refined. Strangulation was his preferred means, but it wasn't a simple act of ending a life. Survivors reported that he would deliberately bring them to the brink of death, then allow them to regain consciousness, only to start again. This cycle of suffocation and revival wasn't just physical torture. It was psychological warfare, breaking down his victims while feeding his need for control. By the time he finally ended their lives, he had fully dominated them, both in body and mind. The national exposure from the dating game could have been his undoing sooner, but it wasn't. Few people at home would have recognized him from crime reports. There were no widespread alerts linking his name to violent crimes. This disconnect allowed him to vanish back into anonymity after the episode aired. Still, the case files show that around this period, police in multiple cities began noting similarities in certain unsolved murders. In Los Angeles, a young woman was found strangled in her apartment. In Wyoming, a body discovered off a hiking trail bore similar signs of asphyxiation and post-mortem posing. None of these cases yet bore his name, but the patterns were there for anyone who knew to look. Even among serial killers, Alcala's confidence bordered on arrogance. The fact that he could sit under television lights, cracking jokes, while knowing exactly what he had done and what he planned to do again speaks to the level of danger he posed. It wasn't just that he could blend in, it was that he could step into the spotlight without fear. For a predator like Alcala, this was proof of his superiority, his belief that he could outwit not only his victims, but the entire system meant to catch him. But the dating game episode would not fade quietly into history. Years later, after his arrest and conviction, the footage resurfaced in news reports, shocking the public. Viewers could see him as his victims once had, disarming, self-assured, hiding in plain sight. For investigators and survivors, it became a chilling reminder of how easily a monster can wear the mask of an ordinary man. And for the families of the unidentified women in his photographs, it was yet another piece of the puzzle, a glimpse into the man who may have taken their loved ones away. The game show had been just one stage in Alcala's life, but away from the lights, his real stage was far darker, a private performance where he alone dictated the script, the pacing, and the ending. And in those hidden performances, there was no audience, no applause, only silence. By the early 1980s, Rodney Alcala's carefully maintained facade was beginning to show cracks. He had traveled widely, living and working under his real name but often slipping through the cracks of law enforcement's jurisdictional maze. His photography remained his constant, both as a tool of seduction and, it seemed, as a personal archive of his conquests. The women in those images were not just subjects to him, they were trophies, frozen in time. When detectives eventually uncovered his vast collection, they would be staggered by the sheer volume. Over 1,000 photographs, carefully stored, many showing women and girls whose identities remain unknown to this day. Some looked like modeling headshots. Others appeared candid, caught in moments of laughter or contemplation. But a disturbing subset displayed unmistakable fear, discomfort, or even injuries, hinting at what might have happened before or after the shutter clicked. The turning point came when Alcala was arrested in 1979 for the murder of Robin Sanso, a 12-year-old girl from Huntington Beach, California. Robin had been riding her bike to ballet class when she vanished. Her body was found 12 days later in the foothills of the Sierra Madre. A friend of Robin's described a man approaching them at the beach asking if he could take their pictures. That description led police to Alcala. He was arrested, tried, and convicted, though the legal process would drag on for decades due to appeals and overturned verdicts. While his lawyers battled in court, evidence from his storage locker quietly began to tell a far bigger story. Inside that locker, police found not only the photographs, but also earrings belonging to Robin Sanso, along with items suspected to be souvenirs from other victims. For homicide investigators, this discovery was both horrifying and galvanizing. These were not just random possessions. Killers often keep tokens from their crimes as mementos, reminders of the power they once held over their victims. Each object and each photograph became a potential link in a much larger chain of violence, stretching back years. The scope of what they were dealing with began to emerge slowly. Cold case units from multiple states, California, New York, Washington, and beyond, started contacting one another, comparing notes on unsolved murders. There were patterns: women strangled, often posed after death, sometimes with signs of sexual assault. Many had last been seen alive in the company of a man carrying a camera. In one case, the young woman in Wyoming had vanished after agreeing to let a man photograph her. In another in New York, a flight attendant was found strangled in her Manhattan apartment, the scene eerily similar to those in California. What made these cases so difficult to connect was Alcala's mobility and his ability to adapt. He didn't fit the typical drifter profile. He could hold a job, maintain an apartment, present himself as intelligent and cultured. He wasn't living in the shadows, he was blending into the light. For law enforcement in the pre-digital age, without centralized databases or DNA matching, chasing a suspect like this was like trying to track a ghost. The photographs became a breakthrough tool, but they also presented a massive challenge. Investigators released hundreds of the images to the public in 2010. Hoping someone might recognize the women and girls in them. The response was overwhelming. Families from across the country came forward, identifying loved ones who had disappeared decades earlier. Some identifications brought closure, others opened fresh wounds, as police now had to consider the possibility that these women had been among Alcala's victims. Still, many of the faces remain unidentified, silent witnesses trapped in a frame, their stories untold. Even as the photos generated leads, they also revealed something unsettling about Alcala's psychology. Experts in criminal profiling noted that the act of photographing his victims, whether before, during, or after their ordeal, suggested a need for control that extended beyond the moment of the crime. The camera allowed him to preserve that control indefinitely, to revisit it whenever he wanted. In a way, the photographs were his insurance against time. Even as the bodies decayed or were lost, the images kept his victims exactly as he wanted to remember them. As detectives combed through the evidence, they began to realize that the Robin Samso case, the one that had brought him to trial, was just a single piece of a sprawling puzzle. There were connections to the 1977 murder of Ellen Hutter, the goddaughter of Dean Martin, and Sammy Davis Jr., whose body was found in New York's Rockefeller State Park. There were possible links to Jane Doe cases stretching from California to New Hampshire. The deeper they dug, the more it seemed that Alcala had been killing for much longer than anyone had suspected. And yet, through it all, Alcala maintained his innocence in most cases, smirking in court, challenging the prosecution, sometimes even representing himself during trial proceedings. In one of the most unsettling moments of his later trials, he played a bizarre audio recording in which he conducted a mock interview with himself, switching voices between Rodney and Mr. Alcala, as if cross-examining his own persona. It was a performance that left jurors and spectators shaken, not only by its content but by the glimpse it offered into his fractured, manipulative mind. By now, the public image of Rodney Alcala had shifted dramatically. He was no longer the charming bachelor from the dating game. He was the dating game killer, a name that would forever link his smiling TV persona with the horrors of his crimes. The photographs, meanwhile, continued to haunt the investigation. Each image was a possible crime scene, each face a potential unsolved case. Detectives understood that solving them all would take years, perhaps decades, and even then, the full scope of his crimes might never be known. Still, there was progress. DNA technology, which had advanced significantly by the 2000s, began linking Alcala to cold cases with a level of certainty that earlier investigators could only dream of. It was this emerging science that would ultimately help prosecutors tie him to murders across multiple states, turning suspicion into conviction. But before that, they still had to build a narrative compelling enough to bring him down once and for all. And with Alcala, every step toward justice was met with resistance, manipulation, and the unnerving possibility that more victims remained undiscovered. By the mid-2000s, Rodney Alcala had already been in and out of courtrooms for years, his legal odyssey a tangled mess of convictions, appeals, and retrials. But in the background, something far more dangerous for him was happening. Cold case detectives were quietly and methodically piecing together a timeline of murders that spanned decades and crossed multiple state lines. With DNA analysis now a standard tool, they were able to revisit evidence collected in the 1970s and 1980s, hair strands, bodily fluids, clothing fibers, and test them with accuracy that had been impossible during Alcala's earlier trials. What they found was damning. His genetic fingerprint began appearing in cases long thought unsolvable. Suddenly, the man who had fought for years to overturn a single murder conviction was now facing the possibility of being linked to 5, 6, maybe even more killings. California authorities were the first to make the leap. In 2003, DNA from Alcala was matched to the 1977 murder of Jill Barkham, a 19-year-old runaway whose body was found in the Hollywood Hills, and to the killing of Georgia Wickstead, a 27-year-old nurse murdered in her Malibu apartment in 1978. Two other victims, Charlotte Lamb and Jill Parento, both young women in their 20s, were also tied to Alcala through DNA testing. Each case told a similar story. The women had been strangled, often sexually assaulted, and sometimes posed after death. These details matched what investigators already suspected. that Alcala was not a killer who acted impulsively, but rather one who planned, staged, and savored his crimes. The evidence pile grew heavier when detectives from New York reached out. In 2011, DNA linked Alcala to the 1971 murder of Cornelia Crilly, a 23-year-old TWA flight attendant who had been raped and strangled in her Manhattan apartment. For decades, her case had remained a painful mystery to her friends and family. Now, with one lab result, they finally had a name, and that name belonged to a man already serving a death sentence in California. Another link emerged in the 1977 murder of Ellen Hover, whose disappearance had drawn significant media attention at the time because of her celebrity connections. Her remains had been found in a remote area of New York's Rockefeller State Park. Alcala's name had been in the investigation files back then, but without physical evidence, he'd slipped away. DNA gave them what they had lacked: proof. Building a multi-state murder case was a logistical nightmare. Prosecutors had to navigate differences in jurisdiction, coordinate evidence handling, and decide whether to try him in California first or extradite him to New York. Ultimately, California took the lead, charging Alcala with 5 murders that spanned from 1977 to 1979. The trial, which began in 2010, was unlike anything the public had seen before. Alcala, ever the manipulator, chose to act as his own attorney, questioning witnesses and even cross-examining himself in a bizarre back-and-forth where he shifted voices between the lawyer and the defendant. Courtroom observers described the atmosphere as both chilling and surreal. Here was a man accused of some of the most methodical, brutal murders in modern history, speaking casually about the evidence against him as though it were a bad parking ticket. He smiled at jurors. He referred to the women he was accused of killing in detached, almost clinical terms. And then there were the photographs, hundreds of them, projected on courtroom screens for the jury to see. Prosecutors were careful in their selection, showing only those directly tied to the charges at hand, but even those few images made an impact. They revealed a man who saw his victims not as people, but as props in an endless, twisted photo shoot. The defense, what little of it existed, tried to undermine the reliability of decades-old evidence, to cast doubt on the chain of custody for the physical samples, to suggest that the photographs were merely part of Alcala's artistic expression. But the DNA was unshakable. Jurors heard from forensic experts who explained, in meticulous detail, how the samples had been preserved, tested, and matched. They heard from families of the victims, who spoke not only of their loss, but of the cruel limbo they had endured for years without knowing the truth. When the verdict came in, it was swift: guilty on all counts. The jury sentenced Alcala to death for the murders of Jill Barkham, Georgia Wickstead, Charlotte Lamb, Jill Parenteau, and Robin Samso. For the families, it was both a victory and a bitter reminder that justice had taken far too long. Many could not help but wonder how many other names should have been read alongside those 5, how many other women had vanished into the shadows of his lens. Even after his California conviction, New York prosecutors weren't finished. In 2012, Alcala was extradited to face charges for the murders of Cornelia Crilly and Ellen Hover. He pled guilty in 2013, receiving an additional sentence of 25 years to life, though by that point it was largely symbolic. He was already condemned to death in California. Still, those convictions mattered. They closed the book, at least officially, onto cases that had haunted families for more than 3 decades. Outside the courtroom, the release of Alcala's photographs to the public continued to generate leads. Each new identification brought a fresh wave of investigation, sometimes reopening cold cases that had long been dormant. Law enforcement officials believed that the true number of Alcala's victims could be far higher than the 7 murders he had been convicted of. possibly as many as 50 or more. But without definitive evidence, many of those cases remain in limbo, their victims remembered only in faded snapshots and missing persons files. By now, Alcala's double life was fully exposed. The charming TV contestant, the art school graduate, the man with the ever-present camera, all masks for a predator who used his talents and his persona to disarm, lure, and destroy. His trials might have brought some measure of closure, but they also underscored an unsettling truth. For years, he had been hiding in plain sight, killing without consequence, while the world watched and smiled as he played the part of the perfect date. And yet, even with him locked away, the photographs still lingered, each one holding a story that might never be told. The case of Rodney Alcala was technically winding down in the courts, but for the detectives, journalists, and families involved, it was far from over. The images he left behind were more than evidence. They were ghosts, silent and unblinking, waiting for someone to finally call them by name. When the trials were over and Rodney Alcala was secured behind the thick walls of California's death row, it might have seemed like the story had finally reached its conclusion. But in many ways, it was just entering a new phase, one driven not by court proceedings, but by a haunting visual archive that refused to fade from public memory. In 2010, the Huntington Beach Police Department made the decision to release 120 of Alcala's photographs to the public. They did so with careful deliberation, weighing the need to protect the dignity of possible victims against the potential for solving cold cases. The images, recovered from a storage locker Alcala had rented, were unlike anything most officers had seen before, not evidence in the traditional sense, but an eerie, sprawling catalog of strangers, men, women, and children, frozen in time by the lens of a killer. The decision to release them came with a warning. These were not simply old snapshots from a forgotten photographer's portfolio. Some of the people depicted were confirmed victims. Others were missing persons. And still others were complete mysteries, their identities, whereabouts, and fates entirely unknown. Within hours of the release, the images began circulating online on news sites, blogs, and eventually social media. Family members of missing people poured over the galleries, their eyes scanning every face, every background detail, looking for something, anything familiar. For some, the experience was devastating. A handful of families recognized their loved ones instantly, not from the circumstances of the photographs, but from the way they smiled, the tilt of their head, the set of their jaw. It was a shock to see them in Alcala's work, a sickening confirmation that they had crossed paths with him, and likely never left alive. But just as many leads led nowhere. Tips poured into police departments in California, New York, and beyond, each one a thread to be pulled. Officers followed up on sightings from decades ago, tracked down relatives, and compared details against missing persons reports. In some cases, the subjects of the photos were found alive, older, changed, sometimes unaware that their picture had ever been taken. A few recalled the encounter, a man with long hair and a confident manner approaching them in a park or on a beach, asking if they'd like to model. They'd posed, thanked him, and gone about their day, never realizing how close they'd come to being part of something far darker. The media dubbed the collection the Album of Death, a name that was both sensational and, for many, tragically apt. News segments ran the images in slow succession, inviting viewers to call in if they recognized anyone. For law enforcement, it was both a blessing and a burden. On one hand, the public exposure generated genuine breakthroughs, identifications that might otherwise never have happened. On the other, it opened a floodgate of false leads, each one requiring time, resources, and careful verification. Detectives who had worked Alcala's murders decades earlier found themselves dragged back into the case, sifting through new layers of uncertainty and grief. Among the photographs were recurring themes, parks, beaches, city streets, and recurring visual cues, like Alcala's penchant for shooting subjects off-center or capturing them in moments of guarded expression rather than relaxed joy. It was as if he sought to catch them between poses, in that fleeting second when their guard was down. Some images had an almost staged feel, suggesting that Alcala had orchestrated more than just a shot. And when investigators looked closely, they noticed patterns. Certain locations repeated, certain items of clothing reappeared in different contexts. This hinted at the possibility that some sessions had occurred just hours or even minutes before the victims were killed. For families, the photographs were double-edged. In the rare cases where a victim's fate could be confirmed, there was a grim relief in having answers. But more often, the images opened wounds that had never fully healed, forcing loved ones to confront the uncertainty of whether the smiling or wary figure in the frame had met a terrible end. The ambiguity was crushing. Without a body, without physical evidence, the law could not declare them dead. Without a confession from Alcala, and he remained silent on most of them, they existed in a purgatory of unresolved grief. The FBI took an interest in the case, recognizing that Alcala's mobility and the long span of his crimes meant the photographs could include victims from anywhere in the United States, and possibly beyond. They distributed the images through their own channels, cross-referencing them with unsolved murders and missing persons cases stretching back to the 1970s. Some leads extended as far as Wyoming, Washington, and even into Canada. Each identification, even if it did not lead to a confirmed murder, added a new piece to the puzzle of Alcala's movements and methods. The release of the photographs also stirred something darker in the public imagination. They became objects of morbid fascination, circulating on true crime forums, YouTube channels, and podcasts. People speculated endlessly about the stories behind each face, sometimes creating entire narratives based solely on a single image. This voyeuristic interest was not lost on the families of the missing, many of whom found the public consumption of these images deeply unsettling. But others welcomed the attention, hoping that someone somewhere might recognize a face and provide the missing piece of information that had eluded investigators for decades. Through it all, Alcala himself remained largely unmoved. From his cell, he occasionally sent letters to journalists or corresponded with people who reached out to him, but he offered no new confessions, no clarifications, and certainly no remorse. The photographs were his silent legacy, one he never tried to defend or explain. Whether they were trophies, keepsakes, or simply a byproduct of his compulsions, only he truly knew. And that silence left an open question hanging over every frame. How many of these faces belonged to people who never came home? By the mid-2010s, the number of confirmed identifications from the photo release remained small compared to the total, leaving a majority of the images shrouded in mystery. The collection became both a symbol of investigative persistence and a reminder of the limits of even the most determined police work. Some cases would never be solved. Some names would never be spoken aloud in a courtroom. But the photographs ensured they would not be entirely forgotten. Each one was a frozen moment in time, a haunting testament to the people Alcala encountered, and, in too many cases, destroyed. And yet, as time passed, another realization began to take hold among investigators and the public alike. The photographs were not the end of the story. They were, in many ways, just a map, one that hinted at the full scale of Alcala's reach, but still left vast stretches blank. Filling in those blanks would require revisiting old case files, testing long-stored evidence, and perhaps confronting the uncomfortable truth that even now, with the killer gone from the streets, the ripple effects of his crimes were still spreading outward, touching lives in ways no one could have predicted. By the time Rodney Alcala entered his final decade on death row, the passage of years had transformed his image in the public eye. Gone was the charismatic, long-haired figure who had once prowled beaches and parks with a camera slung over his shoulder. In his place sat an aging man with a gaunt face, thin hair, and the unmistakable weight of decades spent in prison. For most inmates awaiting execution, the end comes sooner than later, but California's death penalty system, mired in appeals and legal challenges, meant Alcala had time to watch the world change, time to see his own name fade from headlines only to resurface whenever another lead emerged from the photographs or a cold case file. Inside the prison, Alcala maintained an enigmatic routine. He kept largely to himself, though guards noted his tendency to observe others with an unnerving attentiveness, as if studying the human condition even within the confines of a maximum security facility. Occasionally, he would write letters, some to journalists, others to complete strangers who had contacted him after seeing documentaries or reading about his case. These letters were rarely confessional. More often, they were filled with rambling thoughts, odd digressions, or philosophical musings that gave no real insight into the crimes that had brought him there. For the families of his victims, it was infuriating. They wanted closure, details, anything that might explain why their loved ones had been targeted. Alcala gave them nothing. Outside prison walls, the investigation into his possible additional victims never stopped. Detectives across multiple states revisited old murder files, focusing on unsolved cases from the 1970s and early 1980s that matched Alcala's known movements and methods. Advances in forensic technology, particularly in DNA analysis, began to bear fruit. In 2011, DNA evidence linked Alcala to the murders of two women in New York, Cornelia Crilly and Ellen Hubbard, cases that had been cold for decades. Their families, long trapped in the limbo of unanswered questions, finally learned who had taken them. But these revelations only deepened the suspicion that there were more, many more, whose names would never be matched to the killer. The scale of Alcala's possible crimes became a subject of debate among law enforcement. Some investigators believed his confirmed victim count was only a fraction of the truth, estimating that he might have killed as many as 100 people. Others were more cautious, noting the danger of attributing every unsolved case to a single offender. But even the most conservative estimates placed him among the most prolific killers in American history. And unlike some serial predators who operated in tightly defined areas, Alcala had traveled extensively: California, New York, Washington, Wyoming, possibly overseas. Each move left a trail of potential victims in his wake. The photographs remained a central focus of these efforts. Even years after their public release, they continued to yield new leads. In some instances, aging technology was replaced with more sophisticated facial recognition tools, allowing investigators to make fresh comparisons between Alcala's images and missing persons databases. These new matches brought both breakthroughs and heartbreak. A few people were found alive decades older but still able to recall their encounter with Alcala. Others were conclusively identified as murder victims, finally giving their families a name to put on a headstone. But for the majority, the trail remained cold. Faces without names. Names without stories. Meanwhile, the cultural fascination with Alcala persisted. True crime documentaries revisited his case, often highlighting his appearance on The Dating Game, the surreal moment in television history, when a future convicted serial killer charmed both the studio audience and the woman he would win as a date. This bizarre intersection of entertainment and evil became a chilling reminder of how easily predators could blend into everyday life. Interviews with surviving relatives of victims, retired detectives, and criminologists painted a complex portrait of Alcala, a man who was at once highly intelligent, manipulative, and capable of extraordinary cruelty. In the final years of his life, Alcala's health began to decline. Years of incarceration had taken their toll, and by the late 2010s, he was frequently moved to the prison's medical wing. Still, the legal process dragged on. Appeals were filed and denied. Execution dates were set in theory but never in practice, blocked by the state's moratorium on capital punishment. For some families, this delay felt like another injustice. The man who had stolen so many lives continued to draw breath, unpunished in the ultimate sense. For others, it was irrelevant. Death could not undo the damage he had done. In July 2021, Rodney Alcala died of natural causes at the age of 77. The news was met with a mix of relief and frustration. Relief that he could never harm anyone again. Frustration that he had taken so many secrets to the grave. No final confessions. No clarifying statements about the photographs. No acknowledgement of the full extent of his crimes. For many, his death closed the door on answers they had hoped for but never received. Even in death, Alcala's legacy continued to cast a long shadow. The photographs, those haunting, unexplained portraits, remained in police archives and online galleries, still drawing the attention of amateur sleuths and cold case investigators. Every so often, a new identification would surface, reigniting the story in the media and reminding the public that the case, in some ways, would never truly be over. The faces in those images had outlived the man who took them, becoming a silent roll called mysteries that might never be solved. For the families still waiting, the question was no longer whether justice would be served. That chance had passed. It was whether the names of their loved ones would ever be known, whether their stories would ever be told in full. The uncomfortable truth was that, for many, the answer would be no. But in the quiet persistence of investigators, in the attention of the public, and in the enduring power of those photographs, there was a small measure of defiance against the darkness Alcala had tried to leave behind. The man was gone. The shadows he cast were not. By the time the trial finally wound to its end, the public image of Rodney Alcala had shifted from curiosity to revulsion. The smiling bachelor, one from a once-forgotten television clip, was now etched into collective memory as a predator who stalked his prey with the same patience he used to frame a photograph. His attorneys fought to suppress certain pieces of evidence, but the sheer weight of it, the photographs, the witness testimonies, the forensic matches, was insurmountable. The jury did not take long to deliver its verdict. Multiple counts of first-degree murder. Death sentence. It was the only possible conclusion to a case that had haunted detectives for decades. In the years that followed, investigators continued to release images from his hidden collection, hoping the public might help identify the unknown faces. Some families found closure in recognizing a loved one, even if the confirmation came years too late. Others were left in limbo, staring at the haunting, grainy images and wondering whether they were looking at someone they had once known or someone they had lost. Each photograph became its own little crime scene, frozen in time, waiting for a resolution that might never come. Even now, law enforcement officials estimate that Alcala's true victim count will never be fully known. Inside the prison walls, Alcala lived out his remaining years without the freedom to roam or the lens to hide behind. He spent most of his time isolated, his health slowly deteriorating. To the public, his death in 2021 was little more than a headline, a final period at the end of a long, ugly sentence. There were no vigils, no memorials. Just a passing note in the news cycle, quickly buried under the next day's tragedies. Yet the shadow he cast remained. Alcala had shown how a killer could hide in plain sight, blending into ordinary life while keeping a meticulous archive of horrors. For criminologists, Alcala's case became a textbook example of the hidden predator, the kind who doesn't kill in a frenzy but instead turns murder into a ritual, refining it with each attempt. He wasn't driven by necessity or by sudden rage. He was methodical, patient, cold. And in his own way, he recorded his legacy, not with confessions, but with portraits. The lesson was chilling. Sometimes, the most dangerous people are the ones who appear to be doing something harmless. But Alcala was far from the only one to lead a double life, moving between the ordinary and the monstrous without detection. Across the country, in a very different setting, another man would take that same principle of hidden violence and stretch it over decades. His hunting ground wasn't art studios or the open streets of Los Angeles. It was the neglected neighborhoods of South Central, where the voices of missing women were often ignored, their cases left to gather dust. This man didn't carry a camera. He didn't charm audiences on television. He drove an unremarkable van, worked city jobs, and presented himself as a friendly neighbor, someone you might wave to without thinking twice. But behind that facade was a predator so careful, so selective, that police didn't even realize they were dealing with a serial killer for nearly 30 years. They would later call him the Grim Sleeper. His real name was Lonnie Franklin Jr., and like Alcala, his story would reveal just how long evil can hide when no one is truly looking. When the killings began in South Central Los Angeles in the mid-1980s, no one connected them. The neighborhood was already weighed down by poverty, gang violence, and the crack epidemic, and the murders of women, particularly women on the margins, barely made the news. In most cases, the victims were found in alleys, vacant lots, or abandoned buildings. The cause of death was almost always the same: a gunshot to the chest, sometimes paired with signs of sexual assault. To detectives working those early cases, the similarities were too consistent to ignore. This was the work of one man. But without a name, without a face, and with an overworked police department that lacked resources, the killer moved through the streets without pressure. The victims rarely had the kind of public profile that drew widespread attention. Many struggled with addiction, homelessness, or unstable family situations. Their disappearances went unreported for days, sometimes weeks, and in some cases, no one filed a missing person report at all. This anonymity worked in the killer's favor. He didn't need to hide in shadows. The shadows were already there, cast by a system that didn't see these women as urgent priorities. Each crime scene told a similar story: a single gunshot close range, and a body discarded like garbage. It was efficient, calculated, and disturbingly impersonal. As the body count rose, a task force quietly formed within the LAPD to try to catch the man they would eventually nickname the Southside Slayer. The team pored over ballistics reports, looking for patterns in the weapon used. They compared victim profiles, searching for any common acquaintances. But the investigation kept stalling, partly because the killer seemed to vanish for long stretches at a time. He would strike several times within a few months, then disappear for years. This on and off pattern baffled detectives. Serial killers often escalate, their timelines tightening as their compulsions grow. But this man seemed to pause, as if he could turn his urges off or simply focus his attention elsewhere. In 1988, after a string of murders, the killings abruptly stopped. The task force was quietly dismantled, the files boxed up and stored away. For years, there was silence. The city moved on, or at least pretended to. South Central kept struggling with its own daily crises, and the women who had been killed became just another grim statistic in an era full of them. But the killer wasn't gone. He was just biding his time. During this so-called sleeping period, Lonnie Franklin Jr. lived what appeared to be an ordinary life. He held steady jobs as a mechanic, a sanitation worker, even doing repairs for neighbors. He attended backyard barbecues, joked with friends, and was known for lending a hand when someone's car broke down. He blended in so well that even people who had known him for decades would later say they never suspected a thing. But beneath that everyday exterior was a man who had already killed and who sooner or later would kill again. By 2002, the killings resumed, same weapon type, same victim profile, same execution style method. To the few detectives who remembered the old case files, it was like watching a ghost reappear. Only now forensic science had advanced, and DNA evidence could be used to connect the new murders with the old. Still, the killer's identity remained locked away, hidden behind years of missed opportunities and unanswered questions. And the most chilling part, no one knew why he had stopped for over a decade, or why he had decided to start again. When the killings resumed in the early 2000s, they landed in a city that had changed in some ways, but not in others. Los Angeles had better technology, a better understanding of forensic science, and a more coordinated law enforcement network. But the same neighborhoods that had been hit in the 1980s were still struggling. Poverty, addiction, and violence still cloaked the streets, and the victims still came from communities society was all too willing to overlook. The LAPD began quietly reviewing old case files after noticing that the new murders bore the same unsettling hallmarks as the ones from years earlier. The wounds, the way the bodies were left, the victim type, everything pointed to a killer who had been here before. Forensic analysts re-examined the evidence from the original crime scenes, swabs, clothing, shell casings, and compared it to evidence collected from the new cases. Now DNA testing had the precision to make matches that would have been impossible in the 1980s. When the results came back, they told a chilling story. The same man had killed in 1985, 1986, 1988, and then again in 2002, 2003, 2005. Whoever he was, he had been living quietly in Los Angeles all along, not hiding in another state or serving a prison sentence, but moving about freely in the very neighborhoods where he hunted. The discovery reignited the investigation, but it also created a new problem. The DNA profile didn't match anyone in the national database. The killer had managed to avoid arrests that would require a sample, and without a name to go with the genetic code, detectives still had nothing solid to move on. It was like holding the killer's fingerprint without knowing whose hand it came from. The task force, now formally reassembled, combed through the old and new files again, looking for overlooked clues, small inconsistencies, or possible witnesses who might still be alive. They retraced the steps of both sets of victims, mapping crime scenes across decades to see if geography could tell them what the DNA couldn't. The press caught wind of the revived case and began using the nickname the Grim Sleeper, a reference to the killer's inexplicable 14-year hiatus between murders. It was a catchy label, one that grabbed headlines, but for the detectives working the case, it was also misleading. To them, there was no proof he had truly slept at all. Maybe there were murders during those missing years that had simply gone unnoticed or been attributed to other offenders. Maybe the body count was much higher than anyone suspected. That possibility haunted the team as they worked, because every unsolved homicide in that period suddenly looked like it could belong to him. The investigation began to pick up speed when police decided to use a relatively new tool in law enforcement, familial DNA searching. If the killer himself wasn't in the database, perhaps a relative was. The process involved looking for partial matches in the system, genetic similarities that could point to brothers, fathers, or sons of the unknown suspect. It was a gamble, one that had never been tried on a case of this scale in California. But the alternative was to keep chasing a ghost with no name, and by now detectives knew they were running out of time before he struck again. In July 2010, the gamble paid off. The search flagged a partial DNA match to a man in prison on an unrelated weapons charge, the killer's own son. That breakthrough pointed them straight toward Lonnie Franklin Jr., a 57-year-old mechanic living quietly in South Los Angeles. He had no high-profile criminal record, nothing that screamed serial killer, yet as soon as detectives began watching him, the ordinary mask began to crack. Once the name Lonnie Franklin Jr. was on the table, the task force shifted gears from chasing an unknown phantom to building a concrete case. They couldn't simply arrest him on suspicion. They needed hard evidence that directly tied him to the murders spanning decades. That meant DNA. But because Franklin had never been arrested for a qualifying offense that required a DNA sample, his genetic profile wasn't in the system. The only way to confirm the match was to obtain a sample covertly, without tipping him off. Detectives launched a carefully choreographed surveillance operation. They set up in unmarked cars near his modest peach-colored house in South Los Angeles, the same home he had lived in for years. They watched him run errands, tinker with cars in his driveway, and chat casually with neighbors who had no idea they were living next to one of the most prolific serial killers in California. As history. Franklin seemed comfortable, confident even. He had been killing, and getting away with it, for so long that he probably didn't consider the possibility of being caught a real threat. The break came when undercover officers followed Franklin to a local pizza place where he was celebrating a birthday with friends. They waited, watching him eat, drink, and laugh, all the while keeping their eyes on anything he touched. When he left the table, they moved in. From discarded pizza crusts, utensils, and a partially drunk soda, they collected items with his saliva. The samples were rushed to the lab, and within days, the results confirmed what investigators had suspected. The DNA from Franklin matched the Grim Sleeper profile perfectly. The hunt for the ghost had officially ended. They had their man. But even with the match in hand, the police didn't move in immediately. They wanted to make sure they could connect Franklin to as many cases as possible before arresting him, knowing that the more charges they could bring, the less likely he'd ever walk free. Detectives dug deeper into his past, tracing his movements and relationships back to the 1980s. They discovered that Franklin had worked as a city sanitation employee and had access to areas where bodies had been dumped. They also learned he had previously worked as a mechanic for the LAPD, giving him an unusual familiarity with police procedures, knowledge that may have helped him avoid detection for so long. As they built the case, the scope of Franklin's brutality became clearer. The murders weren't random in his mind. He targeted vulnerable women, often sex workers or women struggling with addiction, who could disappear without generating immediate public outcry. Many were found shot or strangled, their bodies discarded in alleys, dumpsters, or abandoned buildings. It wasn't just the violence that chilled detectives, it was the methodical nature of it, the calculated risk-taking that allowed him to vanish back into his ordinary life after each killing. When the arrest finally came on July 7, 2010, it was swift. SWAT teams surrounded Franklin's home before sunrise. Neighbors peeked from behind curtains as heavily armed officers entered the property. Franklin emerged in handcuffs, expression unreadable, as if he had been expecting this moment but refused to give anyone the satisfaction of seeing him rattled. Inside his house, investigators found a disturbing collection of evidence, hundreds of photographs of women, some smiling, others clearly distressed, eerily echoing the hidden photo collections of predators like Rodney Alcala. The discovery suggested that the official body count, already in double digits, might only scratch the surface of Franklin's crimes. With Franklin in custody, prosecutors prepared for a legal battle that would take years to resolve. And while the community could breathe a little easier, the arrest opened a new set of questions. How many women had Franklin really killed? What had he been doing during that so-called sleep period? And most disturbingly, were there victims whose families still didn't know they had been taken by the Grim Sleeper? When investigators began cataloging the contents of Lonnie Franklin Jr.'s home, it quickly became apparent that they had stepped into the private archive of a man who had lived two lives. On the surface, Franklin was a neighbor, a father, and a familiar face on the block, the guy who worked on cars and waved at kids riding their bikes. But behind the closed doors of his modest South Los Angeles residence was a carefully maintained trove of trophies and records, the kind that spoke not just to his crimes, but to the mindset of someone who never thought he would be caught. The photographs were the first to seize their attention. Hundreds of them stored in shoeboxes, envelopes, and drawers, each image more unsettling than the last. Some were simple headshots, women smiling into the lens in the style of a casual portrait. Others were candid, as if snapped without consent, showing women unaware of the camera. Then there were the truly disturbing ones, women in vulnerable or unconscious states, positioned in ways that made it impossible to dismiss the sinister context. Detectives noted how the photos spanned decades, the hairstyles and clothing changing over the years, the visual timeline of his predatory career. Alongside the photographs were items that had no business being in his possession, pieces of jewelry, ID cards, scraps of clothing. These weren't just keepsakes, they were physical proof that Franklin kept souvenirs from his victims, each one a silent reminder of a life he had extinguished. For investigators, the problem was twofold. They needed to connect each item to a victim, and they needed to figure out how many of the women in those photographs were dead, missing, or still out there, unaware they had once been in the crosshairs of the Grim Sleeper. It was impossible not to draw comparisons to Rodney Alcala, whose hidden album of unidentified women still haunts cold case detectives. Franklin's collection had a similar feel, as if the photographs were as much a part of the act as the killings themselves. They weren't just evidence, they were artifacts of control, an attempt to freeze his victims in time, to own a moment of their lives forever. To Franklin, it was a private gallery. To law enforcement, it was a catalog of potential murders waiting to be matched with names and dates. The more the task force combed through his possessions, the more chilling the scope of his activities became. In one corner of the garage, investigators found tools and equipment that could have been used to restrain or transport victims, ropes, duct tape, plastic sheeting. None of it proved murder on its own, but taken together with the photographs and the DNA evidence, it painted a damning portrait of a man whose quiet years were anything but. Even during his so-called dormancy, Franklin had likely been active in ways that didn't leave bodies in alleys, perhaps assaults, perhaps attempted murders, or crimes that were never reported at all. Detectives also uncovered notebooks filled with mundane details of Franklin's life, grocery lists, car repair notes, phone numbers, but interspersed with these ordinary entries were cryptic references that could have been linked to his crimes. Dates with no explanation, initials, street names. They would spend months trying to decode these fragments, hoping they might lead to unidentified victims. Every page seemed to confirm that Franklin was not a man who acted on impulse. He planned. He recorded. He kept track. By the time the search of his home was complete, the evidence lockers were overflowing. Prosecutors now had more than just the DNA match tying Franklin to multiple murders. They had a treasure trove of circumstantial evidence suggesting a far greater number of victims than anyone had feared. It was a delicate balance. They couldn't overwhelm the jury with speculation, but they also couldn't ignore the possibility. that the Green Sleeper had been one of the most prolific serial killers in American history. As the legal process began to move forward, Franklin remained in custody, largely silent. He didn't confess, didn't gloat, didn't offer insight into his motivations. In some ways, that made the photographs all the more disturbing. They were the only voice he had left in the case, and they spoke volumes. In the months following Lonnie Franklin Jr.'s arrest, Los Angeles prosecutors found themselves in possession of a case that was both solid and sprawling. The DNA evidence alone linked Franklin to multiple murders, but the sheer breadth of what investigators had uncovered inside his home complicated matters. The photographs, the personal items, the possible victim connections, it all hinted at a predator with a much larger body count than the official charge sheet reflected. The challenge wasn't just to prove Franklin guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. It was to present the case in a way that didn't overwhelm jurors or risk the defense painting the prosecution as overeager. Deputy District Attorneys Beth Silverman and Marguerite Rizzo began the painstaking process of organizing the evidence into a narrative that would be airtight in court. They knew the DNA was their anchor, a hard, irrefutable link to at least 10 murders spanning from the mid-1980s to 2007. But the rest of the material, while compelling, required careful framing. The defense would argue that the photographs meant nothing, that they were simply mementos from consensual encounters, that Franklin's home contained no direct proof of murder beyond what the DNA tied to specific victims. That meant every additional piece of evidence had to be vetted, every photograph scrutinized, every scrap of paper considered for its potential evidentiary value. Meanwhile, the LAPD's cold case unit and a dedicated task force continued to work in the background, comparing the women in Franklin's photo collection against missing persons reports and unsolved homicide files. It was a grim process. Families who had been waiting decades for answers were suddenly contacted, shown photographs of their loved ones taken in settings they didn't recognize. Some women were confirmed to be alive, their images relics of long-ago encounters with Franklin that hadn't ended in murder. But others were never found, and the implication hung heavy over the entire investigation. How many of these women had simply disappeared into the vast, unsolved void of Los Angeles crime? As the case progressed toward trial, the public's awareness of the Green Sleeper exploded. Media outlets ran headlines that combined the lurid nickname with grainy images of Franklin, making him a household name. Talk shows and crime documentaries speculated on his psychology, how a man could stop killing for years, only to start again. Victims' advocates pushed for more resources to be devoted to investigating the hundreds of cold cases that might be tied to him. For many Angelenos, the case wasn't just about Franklin, it was about the systemic failures that had allowed a predator to operate for so long in marginalized communities without drawing serious police attention. The defense, led by attorney Seymour Amster, adopted a combative stance from the start. Amster attacked the credibility of the DNA testing, raising the specter of contamination or mishandling. He painted Franklin as a scapegoat, someone being railroaded by a justice system desperate to close unsolved cases. He also seized on the racial dynamics at play. Most of Franklin's known victims were black women from economically disadvantaged neighborhoods, suggesting that the LAPD had historically neglected these communities, and now sought to make up for it by pinning as many cases as possible on one man. But the prosecution had a trump card: the survivors. A handful of women had lived through encounters with Franklin and were willing to testify. Their accounts painted a chillingly consistent picture: the casual approach, the sudden eruption of violence, the near-fatal strangulations. These testimonies bridged the gap between the cold, clinical world of DNA analysis and the visceral human horror of what Franklin had done. Each story was another thread tying the quiet, seemingly harmless man in the defendant's chair to the calculated predator the evidence described. By early 2016, after years of pre-trial maneuvering, the case was finally set to go before a jury. Courtroom security was tight, and media interest was at a fever pitch. The trial would be the culmination of decades of pain for the victims' families, the result of a dogged investigation that had spanned technology gaps and departmental shifts. For the prosecution, it was their moment to show that the grim sleeper had not just been caught, but that his crimes would be laid bare in all their disturbing detail. For Franklin, it was the moment when the life he had lived in the shadows would be dragged into the light piece by piece. When the trial of Lonnie Franklin Jr. began in February 2016, the Los Angeles Superior Court became the stage for one of the most haunting criminal proceedings the city had seen in decades. Prosecutors opened with a methodical, almost clinical statement of the facts: 10 murders, spanning more than 2 decades, all linked by DNA and a chillingly consistent method of killing. The victims were introduced not as statistics, but as people, their names read aloud, their photographs displayed for the jury to see. The effect was immediate and sobering. Franklin sat at the defense table, his expression largely unreadable, wearing the same glasses and faintly bemused look he had worn through much of his pretrial hearings. The prosecution's strategy was to let the science speak first. Experts from the LAPD's crime lab and the California Department of Justice walked jurors through the DNA matches, explaining how samples taken from the crime scenes, sometimes decades old, had been stored, preserved, and eventually tested. Charts, timelines, and photographs were projected onto a large screen. Each match was presented like a puzzle piece clicking into place. The same man's genetic profile appearing again and again at scenes scattered across time and neighborhoods. The evidence was compelling, but it was also intentionally heavy with detail, aimed at preemptively countering the defense's inevitable claims of contamination or mishandling. Then came the human voices, the survivors. One woman, identified in court only as Enietra Washington, recounted a night in 1988 when she accepted a ride from Franklin, believing he was simply a neighbor being kind. Instead, she described how he shot her in the chest, sexually assaulted her, and left her for dead on the side of the road. Her voice trembled at times, but she remained composed, locking eyes with Franklin as she told the jury, "I thought I was going to die that night." Another survivor described waking up in an unfamiliar house, naked and bound, with Franklin standing over her. She spoke of the smell of the room, the sound of a camera shutter, and the cold, detached way he had studied her before assaulting her. These testimonies had a palpable impact on the jury. While the DNA evidence had laid the foundation, the survivors' accounts brought the brutality into sharp focus. Jurors could now see Franklin not just as a distant figure in police reports, but as a living, breathing predator whose calculated violence left deep scars on those who escaped him. Prosecutor Beth Silverman used these moments to draw parallels between the survivors and the victims who could no longer speak for themselves, making it clear that the same man who sat quietly in the courtroom had committed acts of shocking cruelty over and over again. The defense fought back with a two-pronged approach, challenging the reliability of the forensic evidence and attacking the credibility of the witnesses. Attorney Seymour Amster suggested that the survivors' memories had faded over time, that their identifications were tainted by media coverage, and that Franklin was a convenient fall guy for the LAPD, eager to close long-unsolved cases. He pressed the DNA experts on chain of custody protocols, insinuating that evidence might have been tampered with or misinterpreted. But under cross-examination, the state's witnesses held firm, reiterating the meticulous steps taken to ensure accuracy. In the courtroom, Franklin's demeanor rarely changed. He occasionally scribbled notes or whispered to Amster, but he seemed largely indifferent to the emotional weight of the testimony. Some observers speculated that his calm was a form of arrogance, a belief that despite the mountain of evidence, he might still outmaneuver the system. Others saw it as detachment, the same absence of empathy that had allowed him to commit his crimes without apparent remorse. Outside the courthouse, the trial drew daily crowds, family members of victims, activists, journalists, and curious members of the public. For many in the community, the proceedings were not just about Franklin's guilt, but about finally giving voice to women whose deaths had been ignored or undervalued for far too long. Each day's testimony was dissected on local news broadcasts, with pundits debating whether the Grim Sleeper moniker had helped or hindered the prosecution's case. As the weeks wore on, the prosecution meticulously laid out the physical evidence found in Franklin's home, the photographs, the firearms, and the objects believed to belong to victims. The photo collection was presented with solemn care, each image shown only long enough to establish context. Jurors were told that many of these women had never been located, a fact that hung over the trial like a shadow. The implication was clear: Franklin's confirmed body count might be only a fraction of his actual victims. By the time the prosecution rested its case, the jury had heard from more than 70 witnesses. The evidence was vast, the stories harrowing, and the portrait of Franklin that emerged was that of a man who had hidden in plain sight, exploiting systemic blind spots to commit unspeakable crimes over decades. The defense was about to present its case, but the momentum, at least in the court of public opinion, was already heavily against the man accused of being one of Los Angeles' most prolific serial killers. When it was finally the defense's turn to present its case, the shift in the courtroom was subtle but noticeable. The defense table became more animated, with Franklin's attorney Seymour Amster taking on a more aggressive posture. His task was monumental: dismantle months of painstakingly built prosecution evidence, or at least create enough doubt in the minds of the jurors to prevent a conviction. From the outset, it was clear that Amster was not going to present an alternative theory of the crimes. There was no mysterious other suspect to pin the murders on. Instead, his strategy was to attack the integrity of the state's evidence piece by piece, hoping that small fissures could combine into reasonable doubt. The first area he targeted was the forensic evidence. He called in independent DNA experts, people who had impressive resumes and spoke with authority. These experts didn't deny that the genetic profiles from the crime scenes matched Franklin's. Instead, they focused on the possibility, however remote, that contamination could have occurred in the decades-long span between the collection of evidence and its eventual testing. They talked about storage conditions, degradation of samples, and the challenges of maintaining perfect chain of custody records in a large metropolitan police department with limited resources. Amster emphasized that some of these samples had been handled by multiple technicians, some of whom were no longer available to testify. The implication was that gaps in the paper trail could be enough to question the reliability of the conclusions drawn from it. Next came the attack on witness credibility. Survivors like Enietra Washington had already faced grueling cross-examination during the prosecution's presentation, but the defense brought in psychologists to testify about the malleability of memory. They cited studies showing how human recollections can be influenced by suggestion, time, and even media coverage. They argued that Washington's vivid memory of Franklin's face could have been solidified not by the actual event, but by later seeing his photograph in news reports. It was a delicate line to walk. The defense couldn't overtly accuse these women of lying without alienating the jury, so instead they framed it as the tragedy of an honest person being mistaken. The defense also took aim at the LAPD itself. Amster suggested that the department, embarrassed by decades of unsolved murders in South Los Angeles, had been under immense pressure to close the cases once the DNA link to Franklin surfaced. This pressure, he argued, might have led investigators to fit the evidence to their theory rather than the other way around. He pointed to the lack of physical evidence directly tying Franklin to some of the crime scenes: no fingerprints, no eyewitnesses, no video, only the DNA, which, in the defense's telling, could be explained away by secondary transfer or even deliberate planting. While Franklin himself did not take the stand, his silence became part of the defense's strategy. Amster told the jury that his client's choice not to testify was a constitutional right, and that the burden of proof rested entirely on the state. Still, Franklin's quiet presence loomed large in the courtroom. He sat stone-faced, occasionally leaning in to whisper to Amster, but never betraying emotion. Some jurors glanced at him often, perhaps searching for signs of humanity or remorse. Others seemed to avoid eye contact entirely. The prosecution's rebuttal was swift and unyielding. They brought back their own forensic experts to dismantle the contamination theory, pointing out that the likelihood of multiple unrelated samples being contaminated in a way that consistently matched Franklin's DNA was astronomically low. They reminded the jury of the survivor testimonies, the photographs found in Franklin's home, and the long pattern of killings that fit his profile. Prosecutor Beth Silverman's closing argument was particularly powerful. She told the jurors, "This isn't a case about coincidence. This is a case about a man who hunted women for sport, who took trophies in the form of their images, and who thought he could get away with it because no one cared enough to stop him. Now you have the power to stop him." Once the case was handed to the jury, the waiting began. In the quiet halls of the courthouse, family members of the victim sat together, some holding hands, others staring at the floor. Outside, reporters gathered in clusters, speculating about how long deliberations might take. The jury had been given a massive amount of evidence to review: weeks of testimony, binders of exhibits, and the haunting photographs from Franklin's home. Day 1 of deliberations passed without a verdict. Then Day 2. On the third day, a note came from the jury room requesting to see certain photographs again and to rehear parts of the survivor testimonies. For the families, this was agonizing. It meant the jurors were taking their duty seriously, but it also prolonged the uncertainty. Each hour stretched, the weight of decades-old grief pressing down on those who had waited so long for justice. Finally, on the morning of the fourth day, word came that the jury had reached a decision. Courtroom seats filled quickly, the air heavy with anticipation. Franklin was brought in, shackled, wearing the same expressionless mask he had maintained throughout the trial. The jurors filed in, their faces solemn, and took their seats. The clerk stood to read the verdicts, one by one, count by count. As each guilty was spoken, the sound seemed to reverberate in the room. Family members wept quietly. Franklin stared straight ahead. The grim sleeper had finally been convicted. The guilty verdict was only the beginning of the final chapter. With all 10 murder counts confirmed, the trial moved into the sentencing phase, and the prosecution wasted no time in making their position clear. They would seek the death penalty. For the families of the victims, this was the moment they had waited decades to see: the opportunity to speak directly to the man who had taken so much from them. For Franklin, it was a shift from cold forensic testimony to something raw, human, and impossible to deflect. The courtroom during the penalty phase was a different kind of tense. Gone was the methodical pace of expert testimony and cross-examination. Now, the air vibrated with emotion. Mothers, daughters, sisters, and friends of the women Franklin had killed took the stand one after another, each clutching photographs that seemed to freeze time: smiling faces from birthdays, graduations, family picnics, faces that had been absent from holiday tables for 30 years or more. Some spoke with trembling voices, others with steely calm, but all carried the same undercurrent of pain. One mother described the last time she saw her daughter alive. She was wearing a yellow dress. She hugged me before leaving the house. I never saw her again until I had to identify her body. Do you know what that does to a mother? Her gaze locked on Franklin, but he didn't look back. Another sister, now grandmother herself, told the jury that the murder had shattered her family, causing rifts that had never healed. We stopped celebrating Christmas for years. It didn't feel right without her. Some families had endured not just the loss, but the indignity of decades without answers. A brother spoke of calling the LAPD year after year, asking for updates, only to be told there was nothing new. They said she was probably on drugs, or maybe she ran off. She didn't run off. He killed her, and they didn't care enough to find out. His voice broke on the last words. The bitterness wasn't just directed at Franklin, but at a system that had allowed him to keep killing for so long. The prosecution used these statements to underscore a theme they had hinted at throughout the trial, that Franklin had chosen his victims in part because he believed their lives wouldn't matter to society. Many were poor, some struggled with addiction, others were sex workers. In Franklin's mind, this made them disposable. Prosecutor Beth Silverman told the jury the death penalty is reserved for the worst of the worst. If this isn't that, then what is? The defense countered with a plea for life without parole, framing it as a more humane punishment. They brought in Franklin's family members, who painted a different picture of the man, a father, a neighbor, someone who fixed cars and barbecued on weekends. They spoke of his health problems, his age, the years he had already spent in custody. Amster told the jury that executing Franklin wouldn't bring the victims back, and that spending the rest of his life in a cell was punishment enough. But it was hard to reconcile those words with the reality of the crimes. Jurors had seen the photographs from Franklin's home, not just the crime scene images, but the hundreds of personal snapshots he had taken of women and girls, many of whom remain unidentified to this day. These weren't just mementos, they were trophies, reminders of his control over the lives of others. The prosecution argued that they were a window into a predatory mindset that had never changed and never would. When it came time for Franklin to address the court, he declined. He stood, shook his head, and sat back down. There was no apology, no acknowledgement, not even a perfunctory expression of regret. For the families, this was one final act of cruelty, a refusal to grant them even the hollow comfort of remorse. The jury deliberated on the penalty for less than 2 days. When they returned, the foreperson read the decision, death. In California, with its long appeals process and infrequent executions, the sentence was more symbolic than imminent, but its impact in the room was immediate. Some family members gasped in relief, others sobbed quietly. Franklin showed no reaction. Judge Kathleen Kennedy formally imposed the sentence, her voice steady as she pronounced that Franklin would be put to death for the murders of 10 women. She noted that the true number of his victims might never be known, but that his decades-long ability to evade justice had caused irreparable harm. "You will die in prison, Mr. Franklin," she said, "and the world will be better for it." After the sentencing, reporters clustered outside the courthouse, capturing the emotional reactions of the families. Some spoke of closure, others admitted that closure was impossible. "He's gone from the streets," one woman said, "but my sister is still gone too." For them, justice was a complicated thing, satisfying in theory, but always shadowed by the reality that the crimes could never be undone. Inside the jail, Franklin returned to the life he had lived for years during the trial. Small cell, limited movement, no contact with the outside world except through glass. Over time, his case would fade from the headlines, joining the long list of California death row inmates awaiting appeals. But for those who had sat through every day of testimony, every photograph, every agonizing detail, the sentence stood as a reminder that even after decades of silence, justice could still speak. Yet in the quiet that followed, the city's undercurrent of unsolved cases remained. South Los Angeles still carried the scars, and the streets where Franklin had hunted were far from free of danger. And somewhere in another neighborhood, another man was living a life that seemed ordinary on the surface, his darker truth still hidden. But unlike Franklin, he would not stay in the shadows forever. His name was Lonnie Franklin, Jr., and the press would one day call him the Grim Sleeper. With the sentence handed down, Lonnie Franklin, Jr. entered the last phase of his life, one that would be measured not in years of freedom, but in the repetitive rituals of prison. His world shrank to the dimensions of a cell, a narrow bed bolted to the wall, a steel toilet in the corner, and the constant buzz of fluorescent lights overhead. The man who had once prowled Los Angeles streets in broad daylight now lived in a space no bigger than the bathroom of the homes he had once visited under the guise of neighborly familiarity. For the families of the victims, the end of the trial brought an abrupt change in rhythm. For years, they had lived in anticipation of each hearing, each procedural step, each confrontation with the man accused of killing their daughters, sisters, and mothers. Court dates had been circled on calendars, work schedules rearranged, travel plans made so they could sit in the gallery and watch justice unfold in real time. When it was over, and Franklin was gone to San Quentin, there was no longer a place to direct that energy. The courthouse hallways they had walked so many times now belonged to other cases, other tragedies. Some families described the weeks after sentencing as strangely hollow. "You think you'll feel better," one woman told a reporter, "but really you just feel quiet. Like the noise stopped but the pain's still there." Others found ways to keep their loved ones' memories alive, candlelight vigils, charity events, scholarships in the victims' names. Still, the sense of unfinished business lingered because Franklin had never given up the truth of how many women he had actually killed. That question, the real number, continued to haunt investigators long after the gavel fell. The 10 convictions were solid, backed by DNA and physical evidence, but detectives privately admitted they believed the true count was much higher. Some estimates put it in the dozens. Others, especially those who had studied the case from its earliest days, suspected it could be as high as 100. The problem was that Franklin's hunting ground had been a place and time where women could vanish without triggering much urgency from law enforcement. There were still boxes of photographs, many of them showing women who had never been identified. The LAPD had released some of those images to the public, hoping someone might recognize a face and connect it to a missing person report. Calls came in, and a few women were identified, some alive, some confirmed dead, but many remained a mystery. Every unidentified face represented a story that might never be told, and in that silence, Franklin's shadow lingered. On death row, Franklin kept largely to himself. He had no friends among the other inmates, no interest in media attention, and no sign of remorse. Guards described him as quiet, compliant with rules, but cold. He didn't write letters or grant interviews. It was as though he had retreated into a private world, one where the only company was the weight of his crimes. To the outside, it was both frustrating and fitting. Frustrating because the truth died with him, fitting because the man who had taken so much life would end his days in sterile isolation. Years passed in that monotony, until March 28, 2020, when guards found Franklin unresponsive in his cell during a routine check. He was pronounced dead shortly after, at the age of 67. The official cause of death was not immediately released, but there was no evidence of foul play. Just like that, one of Los Angeles's most prolific and elusive killers was gone. Not by execution, but by the slow, and remarkable end that so many on death row eventually meet. News of his death reached the families in different ways: phone calls, text messages, alerts from local reporters. Some felt relief, believing it marked the true end of his presence in their lives. Others were angry that he had died without revealing the identities of more victims or the details of his crimes. He took the answers with him, one sister said, her voice bitter. He could have given us closure, but he didn't care enough to try. In the months that followed, there were no memorials for Franklin. His body was unclaimed by family for a time, a stark contrast to the vigils and services still held for the women whose names had been read aloud in court. His death didn't inspire documentaries or news specials. By then, the world had shifted its attention elsewhere. The case had been resolved, the man was gone, and yet, for those left behind, the story was not truly over. Because justice, in this case, had been about more than a conviction or a sentence. It was about recognition, acknowledgement that these women had lived, that their lives had mattered, and that their disappearances had not been inevitable or unworthy of investigation. Franklin's conviction gave that recognition in part, but the unanswered questions left behind were a reminder that even when the killer is gone, the ripples of their crimes move outward for years, sometimes decades. And so, the file on Lonnie Franklin Jr. closed not with the neatness of a solved mystery, but with the reality of human loss, messy, unfinished, and resistant to tidy endings. The city where he once roamed kept moving, its streets were paved, its neighborhoods changing, but somewhere in the memories of those who knew his victims, time stood still. The grim sleeper was gone, but the void he left could not be filled.